Okay, first, thanks so much for the invitation to present and to become involved in this effort. A national native bee monitoring strategy is so important. And my presentation today should help make clear why I personally am so excited about the possibility and what would be in it for state agencies. And I want you to know that I am an independent consultant that works a lot with state agencies, but I'm not employed by a state agency, and that I work on the practical issues of biodiversity conservation across all taxa. So I'm not a bee expert, but I do work with a lot of bee experts. So first I want to give you some context. One of the main reference points for state agencies are the state wildlife action plans, which are comprehensive plans. They're produced by every state and approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The most reliable source of funding for plan implementation is federal. It's through the State Wildlife Grant Program. Going forward, there is potentially a new funding source called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's in both houses of Congress right now, and we're cautiously optimistic that it might pass. If it did, we would have a lot more money to invest in the conservation of these imperiled species. So these comprehensive plans have 8 required elements. I'm going to focus on the first 5. So states are required to identify species of greatest conservation need, their key habitats, the threats that are degrading the habitats or imperiling the species, and the actions that can be taken to recover the species. And then the monitoring that would be done to either assess the species decline or recovery or assess the success of the action implementation. So in the 90s, a group called the Foundations of Success, which is now called the Conservation Measures Partnership, they pioneered the use of theory of change tools, which came out of the business world. Now we call these the results chains. Essentially, what we're saying is that when we can really confidently write a results chain, we can justify directing this limited amount of wildlife conservation money toward a particular issue. So let's talk through an example for bees. So we might say, as an action, that we want to restore the diversity of native floral resources because we know that agriculture and development has significantly reduced available food resources. So that would be the threat. And the threat had the effect of replacing or degrading the native prairies. That's the habitat impact. And we believe that by restoring the food resources, the diversity and abundance of native bees will rebound. So that's the story that is told through those first 4 elements of a wildlife action plan. We're identifying the habitats and the species as the target, the outcome that we want. And we're explaining what we need to do, the action. And then in between, we're trying to outline why the action will have the desired effect by addressing the threats. So state wildlife action plans contain exactly this kind of information for hundreds of species of greatest conservation need. Okay, so that's the context. The first plans were written in 2005. They were revised in 2015, and we are now preparing to revise them for the 3rd time in 2025 for most states. So this is the setting in which the state biologists are working. And I believe they represent one of the users of the data that you might generate through the strategy. So next, we'll dive into the regional species of greatest conservation need. So I work a lot in the Northeast region, where the small states have a long history of collaboration. They have identified shared conservation needs since at least 1999. Including a list of species that they were all worried about. So these regional species of greatest conservation need are a subset of the species identified by each state as species of greatest conservation need on their state wildlife action plans. In 2016, Karen Terwilliger and I helped them develop, update the method for selecting those species and really just like formalize a process for identifying regional species of greatest conservation need, which I do sometimes call RSGCN. Karen and I went on to work through the same process in the Southeast region and the Midwest. So now there are 37 states included in the 3 regions that have identified RSGCN. So when we lead these groups to develop the lists, we always start up front with some kind of navel gazing. We discuss the objectives and the uses for the list. Because when you define how you actually want to use the list, it helps you confirm the criteria you'll use to select the species. So I'm talking about this process because you are in the midst of this kind of process too. And I want to circle back at the end and think about what the objectives and uses of the native bee monitoring protocol might be. So for RSGCN, here are some of the objectives. States are wanting to focus on species with documented conservation concern. They also want to understand the importance of their region in the conservation of the species. We don't really want to work on edge of range species with the limited funding that we have. States are looking for opportunities to collaborate with their neighbors, but they're also wanting to know a little bit more about the context of the species in their state and which ones they should focus on when they do take that broader view. So given the objectives and the uses of the list, we've been using primarily two criteria to identify species that warrant including on a regional species of greatest conservation need list. The root problem that we're solving is that states have nowhere near enough money to address the threats to all their imperiled species. So we want to prioritize the species that are truly imperiled. And these are species with documented population declines and usually somewhat well understood threats. And we call this criteria conservation concern. And then we pair that with, because at the same time, there's no point in directing such limited resources at species for which you can't make a meaningful difference. So states want to work together on species whose core range is within the region, and we call this the regional responsibility. And at this point, I'm sure everybody in the audience has some alarm bells going off because we can estimate regional responsibility and conservation concern for the bumblebees. And beyond that, for the 4,000 bee species, it's just really hard. And that is pretty much the nugget of my data need and what I want to communicate to you. So now let's get to the matter at hand. Like, how can the native bee monitoring strategy help identify the species of concern? And to me, just as important, what can we do about them? So there's nothing new to you on this slide. These are chronic issues. But these are limitations that if we could address them, they would help states prioritize bees as conservation targets, include them on wildlife action plans. So the first one is just simply the recognition that a low number of observations doesn't necessarily mean a bee is imperiled. It may just be a rare bee that's difficult to detect. And so we need to get beyond that issue to determine which ones really need our attention. So how can we assess population trends? Also, what inevitably comes up are the survey biases, like across the taxonomy of bees or by habitat type, by trap method, definitely by season. We know that the early spring bees are underrepresented in collections. And so given those biases, can we set alternative thresholds for concern? For example, when we worked in the Midwest, Bombus variabilis, came up as not having any records since 2000. And even though that's always been a rare bee, we can say, well, no records is reason for concern. Another thing that the experts often take into consideration is that when there are very restricted habitat types that were more widespread historically, and when there are species that are known to be obligates to those habitats, then we can infer that those species are in decline as a result of the habitat. So understanding habitat association better would help us with this process. And then just in general, like, what explains the species declines? Because in order to reverse them, we need to know that. So I wanted to talk about the data sources that we do rely on right now. States really rely heavily on NatureServe. Their monitoring programs, for the most part, do contribute a lot of data to NatureServe, and it's a great go-to for us for systematic review because the G ranks and the S ranks are really helpful. but we don't have GNS ranks for a lot of the bee species. So that would be a super helpful thing for us. Increasingly, people are referring to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Discover Life is a good database. I think there's another new one that refuges are using. So we rely on all of those data sets and really appreciate when there are APIs that allow us to access the data with a script. People, and when that fails us because there's not enough information in those databases, I basically use a lifeline, and I reach out to people who probably wish they never shared their email address with me to get second opinions, third opinions on species that the group is feeling that there's concern about. And I also just want to bring up this other issue, which hasn't come up as much in the bee world as it has, frankly, in the stonefly groups, where there are a lot of senior scientists and not very many young recruits coming in who can identify species. So they're using, they're really working hard to develop DNA methods for identification because they don't need to train people so intensively for identification. Okay, so since you're in your own process of discovery, I'm going to throw a couple questions out now as a springboard for discussions. So I don't know the answers to these questions, but my gut says that a challenge for you is that you can name so many objectives and uses because there are so many data gaps. And no matter how great the strategy ends up being, it can't do it all. So we're going to have to make some tough choices about which objectives are the most practical, the most urgent. So I'm just going to talk about, the groups of people that I know and how they would use the data. So my list of users is very much on the applied end of the scale. These people would probably need a middleman to interpret the data and develop best management practices. But I'm thinking about people that work in state agencies that either manage the habitat directly, that work with native plants, wildlife diversity program managers who are managing all taxa, but really, want to do a good job on each one, but they need help with that. And then the state inventory and monitoring programs who could certainly, get involved in helping you implement the strategy. And so what would they do with the data? They would use the data to work on the ground, improving habitat condition in all the ways that you would tell them it would matter. So they would want to know which species are of greatest conservation concern, why those species are imperiled. They would be interested in finding habitat management practices that might benefit multiple species, like groups of bees, or even habitat types with a lot of rare pollinators or even rare turtles. And they would be curious if there are native plants that are in decline due to the loss of maybe a specialist pollinator for the plant. Okay, and they would want to know why, what will get better if we do this conservation, and how will we know if it's better? What can we measure? How can we measure the species or the habitat response? All of those things are things that would help us build better wildlife action plans for bees and get more conservation to help turn things around. Okay, so like in any challenge in conservation, I worry that we risk being paralyzed by uncertainty, unable to take action. I think a worst case scenario would be basically counting bees until there's only bombas and patients left. So I have some hopes for this process. I hope the strategy that you eventually choose is one that keeps conservation action as a primary objective. I hope that the data that you're able to collect can be used to justify the effort and expense of conservation. I hope it will help a diverse constituency do the right things and provide pragmatic stewardship for the nation's 4,000 native bees. Thank you so much for being interested in state agency conservation opportunities. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the session and the work ahead. Thank you very much.